All right, so in order to figure out how we can have productive conversations about complex, controversial issues, we have to first get clear about how we're orienting ourselves toward the topic we're going to discuss. How are we positioning ourselves in relation to the issue at hand? Because how we orient or position ourselves is going to define for us what our goals are and what methodologies are available to us in order to achieve those goals. So if we approach an issue politically, we know right off the bat, well, our goal is to figure out the rules or the policies that we need to implement. We need to figure out what kinds of actions are going to be permitted or obligatory or prohibited. And when we approach issues politically, we're approaching issues collectively. In other words, we're working with some number of other people and try to figure out how things are going to be. We have to get to the point where we can, as a group, despite all of our disagreements and despite all of the tension that arises because of those disagreements, we have to figure out how it is that we can get to a place where we can say collectively, this is how it's going to be. This is how we've all decided it's going to be. And of course, this requires compromise. It requires sharing of power. We've got to figure out a way to work through those disagreements and through that tension. And of course, this is going to require a certain amount of open-mindedness. In particular, we've got to be open to the idea that we might have to change. We might have to change the way that we think, or we might have to change the position we support because we've listened to the arguments of those who disagree with us and we recognize that they may have a point. And because they may have a point, we might need to change the way that we think about this issue and be open to a solution or a policy or a rule that we might not have been open to at the beginning of the conversation, okay? So that's what a political orientation looks like. And I know you're thinking like, oh my God, dude, that is not at all what politics looks like in my world. In my world, politics looks like power politics. It looks like people trying to leverage power over each other. It looks like people sort of yelling at each other, calling each other names. And of course, you're right. Our political culture is super dysfunctional right now. And it's super dysfunctional right now because people aren't as willing to compromise and people aren't as willing to work collaboratively and collegially as they need to be in order to have a productive political discussion. And that's because lots of folks approach political discussions not with a political orientation, but with an ideological orientation. Okay, they come at an issue and they say, my goal is not to figure out collectively what rules and policies we need to implement. My goal is to advance a worldview. I have this worldview. Usually there's some sort of moral component to this worldview that I have determined is absolutely true, and I am not willing to compromise. I am not willing to sacrifice my principles in order to get along with others and find solutions that the collective creates and that the collective agrees to. Instead, I've just simply decided, or me and my group have decided, I and my group have decided, this is how it has to be. And so my focus is on getting as much power, consolidating as much power as I can, not to persuade those who disagree with me to accept my solution, but to impose it on them. And that probably sounds like a more accurate description of politics as you and I experience it in our culture right now. But that's not a political orientation. This is an ideological orientation. And so you might think about it this way. I know that you know that there are some topics, there are some questions that were you to even raise them for discussion in some circles, you would be shouted down immediately for even asking the question. This is not up for debate, say the ideologues. And so they're not open to that discussion. They're not open to new information. They already have it figured out. So you can think about the kinds of questions. I'm not going to dare ask them here because I'll get pounced on YouTube. But you can think about all of the different kind of questions that come up in our culture that cause people to literally start screaming and shouting and trying to drown out the person who's asking the question, okay? Now, when we approach our topic of abortion, we're not looking at this from a political orientation and not from an ideological orientation. We're going to look at this from a philosophical orientation. Big surprise there. And in particular, we're looking at it from an ethical framework. And when we do this, our goal is not necessarily to create new rules or policies, and it's not to advance a worldview or crush somebody on the discussion board and make them accept our way of thinking about this issue. Instead, we just want to understand the nature of the issue itself. And we're going to do that by really focusing on what kinds of questions need to be asked. What does it mean to say that an act is immoral? And is abortion the kind of act that's morally permissible, or is it morally prohibited? And in order to engage these questions from a philosophic point of view, in other words, in order to approach these questions with a genuine desire to understand the nature of things, we've got to be flexible. We've got to be open, not necessarily to compromise, like when we're operating from the political standpoint, but we have to be flexible in our thinking and open to really difficult questions that might in fact make us uncomfortable. Because ultimately, when we approach things from a philosophic point of view, our goal is to simply understand more. We want to understand the issue better so that we can then approach the topic from a political point of view and figure out what to do with this issue.